B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Tuesday, January 8th, and I've got the year right, 2019. Yesterday, I had to edit myself after I recorded the show, as I hadn't updated that RAM in the front of my head. So we are bracing ourselves for a Trump event. One of these contrived, dramatic, reality TV-driven moments that Trump loves. He relishes this. He has been granted broadcast time from the networks. He says he's only going to speak for 8 minutes tonight. And when he gives those teleprompter speeches, they're just awful. You know, he stares. You set up these two panels, and I've used a teleprompter, and you're supposed to drift back and forth from left to right to make it look like you're, viewing the entire audience as you basically stare at the screens. And he just woodenly focuses on the left screen and talks like a robot. And we don't know what he's going to say. The advances are that he has ginned up a crisis. A humanitarian and security crisis that requires, perhaps, emergency powers. And last night on the public television news hour, they featured an interview with a legal beagle from New York University's Brennan Center. And she said, sadly, that the law is extremely broad, and there are no criteria for what is an emergency that a president declares. And I wouldn't be surprised if he threatens to declare an emergency tonight and set some artificial deadline for the Democrats to cave and accept his demand for billions in funding for a meaningless wall on the southern border. And they've added a laundry list of other items to the demands they've been ratcheting up in recent days. The Democrats have held firm so far. And it remains to be seen how they will respond to whatever threats. And we know Trump will threaten. He will refer to the hostages that he has taken, the dreamers, the children separated from their parents. And now he has 800,000 federal workers who are held hostage to this contrived government shutdown. Now, the Democrats demanded equal airtime, and it appears the networks are going to grant that. And then I'm told that some of the networks are going to have tough analysis about the truthiness of Trump's statements after the combined package of Republican and then Democrats are aired. And Mike Pence says the White House is bargaining in good faith. The question I have is, when are the Democrats going to start negotiating? Now, the idea of bargaining in good faith on the part of the White House is just to keep making more and more demands, and then, of course, they'll back off on some of them in order to get the central piece, the funding for the border wall, that Trump is seeking. And their idea of negotiating and compromise is when the Democrats adopt the terms demanded by the Republicans. And Trump has been lying so freely about this. He said the other day that former presidents had told him privately that they should have built the wall themselves. And Jimmy Carter became the latest on Monday to say, no, that never happened. So they're making shit up, and they're going to continue to do that. And what is fascinating is, of course, the facts do not square with the dangerous little imagination and this imaginary crisis that is going on in Trump's head. If you just look at the long-term picture, under Bush, the average number of apprehensions at the southwest border was 81,000 a month. Under Obama, it dropped to 34,000, and under Trump, it's down to 28,000. Now, I know that caravan really scared Trump a lot, and he used it to insert fear into the midterm election voters. And in terms of the government shutdown, the Democrats are proceeding to process bills in the House to open up government departments one by one. And the question occurs to me, I'm a self-employed person, and a week from today, on January 15th, I am required to submit my estimated quarterly tax payment to the Internal Revenue Service. But if they're shut down, am I still required to send the government money? I don't know. but I'll probably play it safe and cough up some cash. So as I mentioned, afterward, it'll be the Chuck and Nancy show, and I guess they'll get equal time. If it's 8 minutes for Trump, it'll be 8 minutes for the Democrats. Then we're told that Trump is planning a photo op in McAllen, Texas on Thursday, where he's going to visit the border, and he's going to look angry and stern and mean and maybe drop one of those Game of Thrones infographics on Twitter. And I don't think much of Steny Hoyer, Nancy Pelosi's number 2 in the House. But he's got this right. There is no crisis. There is no invasion. There is no clear and present danger, as the president would try to convey to the American people to scare them and to justify actions otherwise not justify. And then you have to look at the internal struggle going on at Fox, air quotes please, News these days. Because on Friday, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who said she was going to be leaving, well, she didn't say it, but there were widely reported rumors that she would be gone by the end of 2018. But she's still there, along with all those temporary cabinet officers that Trump is working with. So anyway, on Friday, she lied to Fox and Friends hosts, falsely claiming that last year alone there were nearly 4,000 known or suspected terrorists arrested along the U.S.-Mexican border. And get this, Chris Wallace, who's one of the top anchors at Fox News, he interviewed Sarah Huckabee Sanders on Sunday on Fox. He shredded her talking point in a combative interview, and he cited the State Department, saying there is no credible evidence that terrorists have crossed the southern border, and that the statistic in question actually includes all apprehensions, which had almost entirely been made at airports. And of course, you build the wall, and the airport's still the way that most illegals, as the right wing likes to call them, that's how they enter the country. And I'm reminded of the great Supertramp album from, I think, the mid-'70s. Crisis? What crisis? And Democrats are trying to warn Trump that a declaration of emergency would not be very effective and would be immediately challenged in court. Jerry Nadler, the new Democratic chair of House Judiciary, said, "We will oppose any effort by the president to make himself a king and a tyrant. The president has no authority to usurp Congress' power of the purse." And he said it would be, here's Joaquin Castro of Texas, chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, says it would be profoundly inappropriate for the president to circumvent the legislative branch and single-handedly, against the will of the American people and the American Congress, put up a wall. And Nadler went on to say there's no national security crisis. Trump is wrong to say there is one. I expect the president to lie to the American people, arguing the only emergency on the border is a humanitarian one caused by the administration's war on children. And as we consider other issues related to immigration that Trump has made front and center, and of course the Republicans blame the Democrats. Last night on my local Fox News, it's a Fox television station, and their local news program featured a report from Washington that blamed the Democrats for the government shutdown. And, I don't watch that channel very often. But when you see that kind of biased reporting, and you imagine that many of their viewers just take it at face value, well, there is a real problem in coverage, and the so-called liberal media ain't very liberal. Anyway, here in San Francisco, there's a trial underway. The state of California has challenged a move by the Trump administration to add a question to the 2020 census about citizenship. And at the trial, which began on Monday, they trotted out a former chief statistical advisor to the Census Bureau, and he has the longest Irish name I've ever seen. And I'm Irish American. Colm O'Muir Cheer Tai. Wow. That is a mouthful. Anyway, he said, if you feel that providing this information will make you vulnerable in some way, you're much less likely to respond. The non-citizen population, and by extension much of the Latino population, feels that they're being targeted for deleterious treatment by the federal administration. And he says that conservative estimates are that about 6% of households containing non-citizens would not cooperate in the census, and it would skew the results. And that, of course, leads to reapportionment of congressional districts, the allocation of tax revenues that flow from Washington back to districts, and it is a significant issue. John Bolton, the mustachioed national security advisor to the Trumpster, is on a mission to the Middle East. He is modifying the impulsive Twitter outburst by Trump in December that all of our troops are coming out of Syria and fast. So, as we reported yesterday, Sunday, he stopped in Israel, had dinner with Bibi Netanyahu, and he issued 3 new criteria for U.S. withdrawal. The Islamic State has to be finished, the Kurds have to be protected, and Iran has to be out of Syria. That means that the U.S. is going to be there for a doggone long time. And Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the strongman leader of Turkey, denounced the White House and John Bolton for comments that he made in Israel, saying that he had made a grave mistake when he said that Turkey must agree to protect the Kurds in the event of an American withdrawal. It is not possible for us to swallow the message Bolton gave from Israel, said Erdogan in a speech in his parliament. Turkey, he said, was only opposed to Kurdish militant groups and not ordinary Kurds, and that's bullshit. We all know that. But when Bolton got to the Turkish capital of Ankara, he was expecting to meet with Erdogan. But Erdogan snubbed him, and he then threatened that it is not a question of when they will attack the PYG in Syria. It is only a matter of time. And I believe Erdogan said that as soon as Bolton is out of their airspace, it could begin. Now, I still maintain that it is the right decision for the U.S. to get out of Syria. I don't think it has to be done overnight, but I don't think we should remain indefinitely either. And at the same time, Trump is so disorganized, incoherent, emotional, impulsive, that he leaves everybody baffled, including the Kurds. They're sending up smoke signals, signal flares. Hey, what about us? And the top leader of the Kurds said he hasn't been informed of any change in the U.S. policy. He said, all we've heard are media statements. And they dangle, their lives dangle in the the indecision here. And I still fear that the Kurds will be slaughtered by the Turks at whatever point the U.S. Relinquishes its presence in Syria. And, I don't wish ill for the Kurds. At the same time, I think that that's kind of baked in the cake, and that Obama made no provisions for how to deal with the Kurds when there was some endgame in Syria. And so this is going to be, no doubt, a very messy situation, compounded by the way Trump operates. And Erdogan published a commentary, an op-ed in the New York Times today, a couple of quotes. Militarily speaking, the so-called Islamic State has been defeated in Syria, yet we're deeply concerned that some outside powers may use the organization's remnants as an excuse to meddle in Syria's internal affairs. Turkey proposes a comprehensive strategy to eliminate the root causes of radicalization. We want to ensure that citizens do not feel disconnected from government. Terrorist groups do not get to prey on the grievances of local communities, and ordinary people can count on a stable future. Now, this belies what Erdogan has done just in the last 2 years. He has left tens of thousands of people unemployed, booted from their jobs because of alleged connections to Fethullah Gulen and the Gulen movement. And he has purged tens of thousands of others. And there are many people, including journalists, who are locked up behind those purges. So Erdogan is no credible figure, but that's what we've got. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. And there are great listeners out there like Clifford Johnson, Theodore Kelly, Bill Janetta, and Carla Mahoney. They kick in $5 or $10 a month, and they keep this whole operation going. You can help out too, and I'd appreciate it if you do. Come on over to peterbcollins.com. You click on the menu tab, click on Become a Subscriber. It takes you to the sign-up page where you can make easy choices of $5, $10, $20 a month or a $50 annual subscription. And if you prefer to avoid PayPal, you can direct your correspondence to my P.O. Box 150-660, San Rafael, California, 94915. Well, Ray McGovern last appeared on this program in December. 27 years he spent as an analyst at the CIA. He was a very high-ranking analyst, and he was the manager, the director of several national intelligence estimates. He knows how the game is played inside Spookville. And today at Consortium News, he observes the 2-year anniversary of the intelligence community assessment that was used to drive the media firestorm and the political bias or spin to make the case, which I consider to be mostly fabricated and exaggerated, that Russia manipulated our election in favor of Trump. And so he goes back to that fateful day of January 7th of 2017. And he says, under a drumbeat of anti-Russian hysteria, credulous Americans were led to believe that Trump owed his election to the president of Russia, whose influence campaign helped President-elect Trump's election chances when possible by discrediting Secretary Clinton. Hard evidence supporting the media and political rhetoric has been as elusive as proof of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq in 2002-2003. And he zeroes in on Scott Shane, the Times reporter, who I've interviewed several times, who early on in the coverage inserted the kind of caveat saying, look, there isn't any evidence for this stuff. But he has since kind of ceased and desisted from that angle. He also notes that the Defense Intelligence Agency, which was once run by Mike Flynn, and I think Flynn may be sentenced today. I'm not positive if that has been delayed or not. Anyway, he says the DIA was excluded from the intelligence community assessment because in 2015, it wrote this: the Kremlin is convinced the United States is laying the groundwork for regime change in Russia, a conviction further reinforced by the events in Ukraine. Moscow views the United States as the critical driver behind the crisis in Ukraine and believes the overthrow of Yanukovych is the latest move in a long-established pattern of U.S.-orchestrated regime change efforts. And Ray notes that while Hillary said all 17 intelligence agencies conducted this review, that is simply not true. And he goes on to reprint the transcript of his recent exchange with former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, where he challenged him on his promotion of the Trump-Russia narrative. And so I encourage you to read this piece. It's well-written, well-argued, and it makes the case. And if you do, you go to Consortium News and read it, click on the comments. Because I don't usually look at comments, but I had a little time today, so I clicked on that. And a clever person named F.G. Sanford took the tune of my good buddy Dr. Elmo, the worldwide Christmas hit, Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer, and wrote new lyrics. This is really inspired. Here's some excerpts. Now they're all so proud of Comey. His loyalty is higher than it looks. He covered up that Clinton server. Now Jim and Hillary are selling books. It's not good intel without Brennan. He ignored the Owan hack. Since the press did not report it, we didn't know he was a Clinton flack. Fusion GPS cooked up a story. They bought what Steele had up his sleeve. The dossier would prove collusion, a tale the FISA judges would believe. Clinton's goose got cooked by voters. Those deplorables had won. She had no choice but to blame the Russians and claim that WikiLeaks had wrecked her run. So she warned all of the pundits, told the Times and Maddow too. Brennan, Comey, Schiff, and Clapper all would swear the dossier was true. Clinton lost, but not because of Russians. That's a story that the pundits weave. The experts looked at all the metadata, and it proves the stories make believe. Well done, whoever you are, F.G. Sanford. Well, on the Russia front, the judge in the case of the only challenge to Robert Mueller's indictments of Russians, and that is the company called Concord Management, their attorney, Eric Dubelier, has been reprimanded by U.S. District Judge Dabney Friedrich. And he does use some unorthodox elements in his legal arguments. In his most recent filing, he quoted from Animal House. "Flounder, you can't spend your whole life worrying about your mistakes. You fucked up. You trusted us. Hey, make the best of it." But the judge is not amused. Concord's recent filings were unprofessional, inappropriate, and ineffective. And she told them to knock it off. But despite the unorthodox claims here, it is remarkable that Concord, which is owned by Yevgeny Prigozhin, the so-called Putin chef guy, well, they are challenging these indictments. And it came as a big surprise to the Mueller team. And you get what you get. Meanwhile, there's news about Natalia Veselnitskaya. She was the female Russian lawyer who was one of many people who attended that infamous meeting at Trump Tower in 2016, and she's been charged by federal prosecutors in New York with obstruction of justice. It doesn't have a damn thing to do with Trump. This goes back to a case that started in 2013, and it is loosely related to Magnitsky and William Browder, who had got the Magnitsky Act passed on a spinned-up version of events in Russia, in my humble opinion. Anyway, what it basically says is that Veselnitskaya worked with Russian authorities and did what lawyers do. She inserted 29 paragraphs into a legal brief, and then they filed to request a copy of that from the U.S. court that was hearing the case. I find this trivial, and still, it gets a lot of attention because, hey, there are Russians involved. And here's another case of that. Real Media Overkill by Rachel Maddow last night. She went way deep on this case from Raleigh, North Carolina. It is a Russian couple, and the family name is Teyf, T-E-Y-F. The husband is Leonid, and his wife is Titania or something like that. Anyway, it has surfaced that Mr. Teyf at one point tried to get his wife's alleged lover deported, and in another case tried to hire somebody to get him killed. And we learn from the Charlotte Observer in North Carolina that he's accused of money laundering $150 million from a contract that Putin's chef, Prigozhin, had with the Russian military. And that between 2010 and 2012, they fleeced $150 million. The lawsuit is demanding $39 million in repayment by this couple. And other than the connection to Prigozhin, there is no known connection to the Trump-Russia narrative, to the Mueller investigation, or any of that stuff. It's just because they're Russians. And speaking of Russians, Putin was fingered as the guy who ordered the shoot-down in 2014 over Ukraine of Malaysian airliner MH17. Now, the Dutch conducted the investigation because the largest number of the victims on the flight were from the Netherlands. And they concluded that Russia was responsible. They claimed that this Buk anti-aircraft system had been moved from Russia into Ukraine shortly before the missiles were fired that shot down the flight on the 17th of July in 2014. Now, I am linking in the show file to this podcast a report from Strategic Culture and under the byline of Eric Zuesse, Z-U-E-S-S-E. And I submit it for your evaluation. It makes a very strong case that the Dutch investigation was flawed. It notes that the Netherlands contributed to the coup that took out Yanukovych. They helped fund it. And that they also insisted essentially on veto power over the report that they produced. So The report here that I'm referring to, it runs 26 pages. But they say that based on the response from the Russian government to the most recent arguments supplied by Ukraine that included the engine numbers of the surface-to-air missiles that were believed to have taken out MH17, they included serial numbers. And the Russian government says they have conclusive proof that those Buk missile launchers never left Russia. I'm sorry, let me correct that they had not been in Russia since 1986 when they were transferred from the Soviet Union to its embedded country of Ukraine. And it reads that they have constantly been located in Ukraine since their transfer in 1986. They remained in Ukraine and never again were located in Russia. Now, I don't have the resources here to dig in and say that this is conclusively true or not. But the late Robert Perry at Consortium News was deeply skeptical about blaming Russia for the shoot-down of MH17, and the other issues relate to the fighter jets that were seen shadowing the airliner shortly before it was taken out. And in a report from the Netherlands today, Dutch intelligence is accusing Iran of conducting 2 assassinations on the soil of the Netherlands, one in the city of Almere in 2015, the other in Den Haag, The Hague, in 2017. And they say that Tehran was behind both murders and that the NATO and EU intelligence support that conclusion. Now, these alleged murders related to individuals who were linked to the MEK, and that is this murky group that was once designated as a terrorist group by the United States, but then rehabilitated. And we believe that the reason for that is that they are used for covert operations inside Iran. I don't justify murders and extraterritorial murders, but we have to look at the full picture to try to understand what's going on. Today I'm releasing to my subscribers and listeners at peterbcollins.com, iTunes, TuneIn, Spreaker, and Stitcher, an in-depth interview with journalist Dar Jamail of Truth Out and Dan Hirsch. Hirsch is an expert on the Santa Susana Field Laboratory. And this is an abandoned military site 30 miles northwest of Los Angeles. It is believed to be the location where the deadly and devastating Woolsey fire began in November. And in our in-depth interview, we go into detail about why the fire starting at Santa Susana probably exposed Angelenos to toxic emissions, including potential nuclear fallout. And Dan Hirsch has been following Santa Susana since the 1980s when he was a lecturer at UCLA, and he is unstinting in his criticism of the California Department of Toxic Substances Control and the way it was managed by former Governor Jerry Brown. It's a powerful interview. Here is Dan Hirsch in an excerpt from this new Peter B. Collins podcast.
And the problems that we are seeing are that the media, when faced with scaring people, even if the scaring them would be based on something they should be scared about, has a tendency to try to say, don't worry. And when a government agency, even a government agency like the Toxic Agency that the press has reported over the years about how captured and dysfunctional it is, when it declares everything is safe, there's a tremendous desire to simply report that as though it were true. And the fundamental problem is it cannot be true. You cannot burn hundreds of acres of contaminated land that has contaminated vegetation growing in it and not release some of that contamination. It's just physically impossible. And if you look carefully at the press statement that we were just told about that DTSC, the Toxics Agency, issued about 9 hours after the fire began, they said that their experts had reviewed where the fire occurred and that there was no risk of any release. In other words, that the fire didn't get to any place that was contaminated. We now know that that's a complete lie. DTSC has issued a couple of weeks ago a report with a map in it that shows what portions of Santa Susana burned, and almost all of the field laboratory burned. And the areas that they themselves are showing it burned are areas that they themselves concede are contaminated.
I encourage you to listen to the full interview with Dar Jamail and Dan Hirsch. As I mentioned, Hirsch is sharply critical of former Governor Jerry Brown and the role that he played both at the Department of Toxic Substances Control and with the Public Utilities Commission while he was governor over the last 8 years. And speaking of Dar Jamail, I want to alert you that on Saturday, February 2nd, he will be visiting the Bay Area to talk about his new book called The End of Ice. And that, of course, is related to climate change. It's not about immigration and customs enforcement. And I'll be conducting a public interview with Dar on Saturday, February 2nd in the evening at the First Presbyterian Church in San Anselmo. So if you are here in the Bay Area, I hope you will attend. Well, this is a coast-to-coast phenomenon. Yesterday, we got a new governor here in California, Gavin Newsom, the former mayor of San Francisco. He's been lieutenant governor the last 8 years. And he is the guy who does bold things. And I predict he will make a couple of bold moves that will be declared blunders. But he's the guy who opened the doors to same-sex marriage. And he also led the commission that legalized marijuana in California. So he's not afraid to do big things. And on day one, he announced expansion of the Affordable Care Act to non-citizens, to undocumented persons here in California. The state is going to cover the cost of that. He also is declaring that the state will change the way we buy prescription drugs. We are a huge buyer, and they're going to combine. There used to be 2 million people represented in the group purchase of pharmaceuticals, and now it will be 13 million Medi-Cal beneficiaries. So these are bold steps by the new governor. And on the East Coast, Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York announced that the city will spend $100 million to provide health care for undocumented immigrants and others who can't qualify for insurance. So we're seeing these as ways to keep Obamacare alive. I support single payer, but I don't want to see Trump and the Republicans kill Obamacare the way they have attempted. And so far, we're seeing that it's a pretty tough little critter. In British Columbia, Canadian police arrested 14 demonstrators at an indigenous protest camp in the northern part of BC. It's a nasty winter there right now, and these protesters have shown a lot of pluck to make a stand against TransCanada's effort to build the Coastal GasLink. And in mid-December, a provincial court granted an injunction to block continued protests. Angela Davis, the former Black Panther who taught at the University of California, Santa Cruz, was scheduled to receive an award in Alabama, her native state, in February called the Fred Shuttlesworth Human Rights Award. But the group announced that they have withdrawn that offer. And Angela Davis did not go meekly. I have devoted much of my own activism to international solidarity, and specifically to linking struggles in other parts of the world to U.S. grassroots campaigns against police violence, the prison-industrial complex, and racism more broadly. And it is believed that the invitation and the award were withdrawn because of her outspoken support of boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel's treatments of the Palestinians. She said she'll appear at an alternative event in Birmingham that month, organized by those who believe the movement for civil rights must include a robust discussion of all the injustices that surround us. And one more quote, "I learned to be as passionate about opposition to anti-Semitism as to racism. It was during this period that I was also introduced to the Palestinian cause. I am proud to have worked closely with Jewish organizations and individuals on issues of concern to all of our communities." Take that. And finally, I want to note that my good friend Andy Worthington, who is the world's greatest crusader to close the Gulag at Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, he's coming stateside this Friday. He will be in Washington at the New America Foundation with attorney Tom Wilner. They co-founded the Close Guantanamo campaign. And on Friday, they will also be rallying across from the White House at Lafayette Square starting at 2:30 in the afternoon. And then Andy will be in New York City at Revolution Books on Malcolm X Boulevard at 132nd Street. And that is on Sunday evening from 5 to 7 p.m. If you're in those locations, I hope you'll show up and extend my warmest regards to Andy Worthington and join the effort to close Gitmo. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. Please share it far and wide. You'll find it on YouTube, and I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails.